Hey everybody, Cameron here, EA Zoom meetings. Today is October the 10th, and today we're going to talk about sexuality in astrology. And the reason why I wanted to talk about sexuality in astrology is because I've been talking closely with a friend who is starting on like a somatic sexual education program. So we just been discussing a lot about the topic of sexuality. So I thought it'd be cool to go into a lecture on it and navigate it deeper. And just an open invite for everybody who is watching this later on to know that if you're looking for all the zodiac signs and how they're expressing sexually, then this is not the talk for that. This is a more foundational talk. And this is like the things that we should know or we should tune into before we even go to that level. Because I find an issue with that sometimes, or yeah, I think it's an issue where we go all the way to like trying to learn how to do calculus before we learn how to do addition and algebra and subtraction. So yeah, it's just going to be a foundational talk from the very beginning, from what I perceive as the beginning. So this is the evolutionary astrology format, for perceiving, or I would say the evolutionary astrology lens for perceiving how sexuality and astrology work. So anytime we're working with the EA method, we have to understand the evolutionary axis before. That is like the bottom line. This is the foundation of the whole practice. So yeah, I just put a few quotes up here from Jeffrey Wolf Green. This one is: by understanding the main karmic and evolutionary dynamic in the birth chart, as symbolized by Pluto, its polarity point, in the south node and north node's respective planetary rulers, you can then understand exactly how any planet will manifest in any birth chart, right? So this even is going back to what I just was talking about, how this is not going to be on the signs and such. Because let's say I started talking about the signs and or Venus and Mars and how they play out, we would be totally and completely missing what is actually occurring underneath it, underneath all of it. So we would have a bunch of content, right? A bunch of information with a lack of context. So always remembering that. It's super important to make sure that we're getting a context for the content that we're working with. Here's another quote. He says, by understanding the main evolutionary karmic axis within the birth chart, you will be able to understand what point within the total spectrum of any sign a planet is oriented to. So that's just saying it again. It's like every single sign, every single planet has a spectrum. And to like try to narrow that spectrum down, which is like this so vast, to know the karmic axis will give it more specificity. Yeah. So just understanding that we always go to the bottom line to figure out what is going on so we can contextualize things. Okay, so when it comes to sexuality as well, we have to know the evolutionary state that a person is in. We can all, like, if let's say there's 3 people with Venus in Aries, a Venus in Aries will express very differently in a consensus, individuated, and spiritual state. So I'm just going to give my perspective on what each state is like. So consensus, they used to call it the herd state. So I mean, even though some people see that as a value judgment, I think it's funny, and I like how that is, perceived, because but also I look at it like there's always this picture that comes to my mind where there's like 100 people walking in this direction, and then there's like 3 people who are like lit up in red, like all these people moving in that direction. Let's say they're lit, like they're colored white, right? And then there's like 3 people and they're all looking over at each other and they're colored red. The herd state would be the people that are just like walking in one direction. They're just in the box. They're not necessarily even thinking for themselves. It's on some level they're, I'm not going to say necessarily trapped, but they're living within the confines of the current space and time reality. Yeah, so that's consensus state. The individuation state is essentially, I perceive it as like somebody who is beginning to just think for themselves and stepping away from the mold of what consensus reality says. And then spirituated state, or the spiritual state, is like the state of being in which someone is beginning to orient to themselves through the lens of knowing themselves through source or God, goddess. So those are evolutionary states. And there is another evolutionary state, but I tend not to talk about that one because in my practice, I just don't come across it enough to feel comfortable about speaking on it. So yeah, it's super important that we always perceive and understand people's evolutionary states when we're trying to understand what is going on with the sexuality within the birth chart. And here is a holistic evaluation of sexuality in the birth chart. It is about that. It's about an aspect. It's about the house, the conditioning factors, the evolutionary state, and the karmic axis. Which really, I would actually like flip that upside down. So we would start at the karmic axis. That's where I begin personally, at least. And then I find out what is the evolutionary state of this person. Usually we could find out through what this person is asking. If it's a client, if it's a friend, then you could probably understand the bounds within the evolutionary state of the person. So that's super important to have that one. And then conditioning factors is next, which that is just its own whole cup of tea. The more and more I practice, the conditioning factors are so important. Because somebody could be in an individuation stage, but they had issues with finances when they were younger, which is part of the conditioning factors. And then that would like make the whole chart, be perceived from a different lens. And it's a nuanced thing sometimes to find the conditioning factors. But when we can do that in our practice, it just deepens it a lot. Yeah. So then the house, the sign, and then the aspects as well go into the holistic evaluation of sexuality. So there's many, many factors is really what I'm trying to get at. I could have actually added probably multiple other things there, like the specific planets that we're going to look at when it comes to sexuality. But that's just a general overview. So conditioning and sexuality. This is something that I was looking at a talk from Jeffrey Wolf Green. It was actually like, I'm not sure if it was one of the original talks, but it was a talk from a long time ago. And it kind of blew me away, because learning objectivity in our personal practice, it can look so many different ways, right? I remember him talking about two people coming into like a relationship together. And let's say that in this life, they were siblings, right? That kind of like, I was like, whoa, like for my personal conditioning, I was like putting judgment on that, but he was saying, in the past life, they were partners. And then in this life, they were siblings. So learning to be able to take a step back away from our own man-made conditioning or the current space-time reality that we are in is very, very important when it comes to perceiving people's sexuality, and also just so we can be of assistance and be like non-judging. Yeah, so we had, like I was saying, that made me tap in and deepen my own understanding of my sexuality and how I perceive sexuality. And that was very, very important to me. And it just made so many things click in my head. So I'm just an open invitation to everybody to just, ponder on that. What is your conditioning? And when it comes to sexuality, and how does that make you think, certain types of sexuality might be weird or taboo or, anything like that. Also, the Adam and Eve story is super prevalent when it comes to conditioning and sexuality, because at least where I'm from, in America, I'm from Philadelphia, and the Adam and Eve story is just really prevalent. I mean, man as Adam is perceived as spirit, and then the physical body is Eve as flesh. And just knowing how we have a tendency towards splitting those things. Even in the spiritual communities these days, a lot of times, people who are spiritual, they would never give into their flesh and just have sex, and people who are just definitely like in their body, they try to like renounce spirit. And those two things actually go together, and we always have to remember that from my perspective. Also, the current shifts that are occurring with sexuality, there's so much to talk about there. and I'm definitely still in deep process of learning how to talk about it, that I'm gonna just say tune into the current shifts. Tune into the current shifts because there's so much going on these days. And there's so much that we need to learn to be more sensitive of and be mindful of. But also, it's important that we still are able to be able to express our opinions and not feel persecuted for not being up on the current shifts as well. Because that's something that I've seen happening a lot lately, where people will, speak their opinion and then they just get attacked completely. And I just don't like the polarization of those kind of things. So just an open invite for everybody to tune into that. Okay, yeah. So when it comes to conditioning sexuality, there's multiple lenses that we can see it through. So there's social conditioning, cultural conditioning, religious conditioning, and parental conditioning. And the reason why I just put it here blankly like this is because I was thinking about it the other day, and then I was literally taking all of these conditionings and mixing and matching them, right? So my parental conditioning could be totally different than the cultural conditioning. What does that do to a person? When the culture that you're living in the parental conditioning is totally different when it comes to sexuality, right? Let's say somebody lives in a culture where promiscuity or like things aren't even perceived as promiscuity, right? But the parental conditioning or in the religious conditioning is telling you save yourself till marriage, or uh, even the Adam and Eve story, like we have fallen from grace and we are sinners. In the social conditioning at school might be saying, hey, like everybody's doing it. And like, wait, you're 18 and you still haven't had sex? That's weird. And then at home, your parents are like, thou shalt not. That's, it can be really, really conflicting and confusing for people. So it's just an open invite for everybody again to tune into all four of those layers of conditioning and how that has conditioned your sexuality and how it might actually be keeping you away from your authenticity when it comes to authentic sexual expression. Oh, yeah. So this slide is so important to me. Profane versus profound. So this is just saying like all archetypes can be expressed on a spectrum. Anything, any energy can be distorted, right? Let's think of a knife. Somebody can use a knife to harm someone. And all archetypes can be sacred, right? And I don't know about y'all, but when I'm cutting up my mangoes to get ready to juice, for me, that is like super sacred. So just looking at it from that perspective, it's like all things, all archetypes, all energies, all and anything on some level, from my perspective, can be distorted and used improperly and can be used for something beautiful and helpful and productive. So always keeping that in mind and being able to see where we're at on the spectrum, right? Because sometimes we'll judge things like, oh, I shouldn't be doing this, I should be doing that. When really we might have started all the way over here, very distorted, and now we might be like in the middle ground, but like still, yeah, some stuff might be distorted, but understand it is just a spectrum and work with the spectrum instead of polarizing. Oh, like I had too much sex and I had it in a distorted way because I wanted somebody to take care of me because I never felt that. And and you don't just like keep it. Yeah, you don't just throw it to the other side and just not like think it is sacred to just be pure and not have sex ever again, and renounce the physical body and what our senses are telling us. So just a small bit about history of human sexuality. I got some of this information from Kim Marie, who like she runs the Evolutionary Astrology Network. I love her work. I've been looking at a lot of her content lately, and it's just pretty profound. It's been changing the way I perceive a lot of things. So yeah, go give that a look as well. Also, the EA board message board is always a good tool to use as well. Yeah. So history of human sexuality. So the origin of the species, it's non-monogamous. And a lot of times I find people these days who are saying like, we were non-monogamous in the beginning. Why are we monogamous now? You know, and I'm not going there. Okay, like I'm not saying that it's bad to be monogamous or we shouldn't be or we should be. All I'm saying is the origin of the species was non-monogamous, and that was just a survival thing, right? A survival thing in nature. You know, it's the survival of the fittest kind of thing. So that is where we began as a species. Also, species survival and gender. So this was a really interesting fact that I learned. It was talking about how if a species doesn't have two genders and it just has one gender, the immune system is static. The immune system is static. So when the immune system is static in a species, that means it's more difficult for them to adapt to survive. So any species that has two like different genders is actually a survival function of the species to be able to have a more adaptable immune system. So I thought that was really interesting, especially with all the talks of gender and gender roles and all that changing, Pluto and Capricorn stuff. If you, you know, if you're tapped in like that, but that's just, you know, interesting to make things like that just to be a fact. You know, it's just a fact. You know, so now we don't have to go back and forth about the gender thing. We actually just have adapted in this way naturally, so that we can survive. And also, I found it really interesting that back in the day, people used sex to heal anger. Like that was a social norm, and I could totally see it. Like the Vesta Virgins, you know, people coming back from war, you know, PTSD. We got that going on hardcore in our society, and people needing to come back and be integrated into the reality that, you know, where there's not bombs going off, and you know, and you don't have to be so on edge and, you know, just triggered all the time with, or just having anger as well, because you have that like lens of fighting, you know. And I just never sexuality in general. This was something super important that I've been like tapping deep into within the past, I would say 7 years, is it's actually impossible to remove the sexual act from the emotional body, right? Some people will say like, oh yeah, we're just doing it, you know, and it's just, and they act like it's just a physical act. And I'm gonna say that it's a theory, but because I don't like telling people I'm just like I'm right or this is the truth. But from my perspective, it is impossible to remove it from the emotional body. And from my perspective, it's not necessary to remove our physical body from our emotional body, from our mental body, from our witness body, so on and so forth in the first place. You know, we might separate those things to see what it's looking like on each level. So all those things need to be in congruence in the first place. So just throwing it out there. Yeah. Karmic and genetic history are said to be in the fluids as well. So anytime that we're interacting with people on the sexual level, right? You got the Pluto energy. You got the Pluto energy, which corresponds to genetic DNA, history, fluids. Even think about it, fixed water. What is fixed water, right? Fluids that if you intermingle those fluids, they will be united. Okay, yeah. So a little bit about the primal brain and how in sexuality, actually the sexual impulse emanates from the primal brain. This is the animal brain. This is the like the very, very beginning. And the cerebral cortex does not function this. So when people, you know, no matter what, if whether I think I'm trying to be a monk or if I just got saved and I'm not supposed to have sex anymore because of my conditioning, you know, the primal brain is literally like, yeah, I don't care. It's literally like, I don't care. You know, it's just coming instinctually. The sexual impulse is coming instinctually. There's no higher level functioning to it, honestly. Well, there can be, obviously, because we can make choices, but it's not stemming from that, or it's not, that's not the origin point. And it is in constant dialogue with that, though. Like, should I do this or should I not do this? The impulse is coming. The impulse is coming. Should I do this? Should I not do this? And if we excessively use our cerebral cortex to actually repress the sexual impulse that's coming from the primal brain, that can actually cause rage and then distortions in how we act out sexually. So that's super important, because I know the quote they always say, and I always use it. Anything natural and repressed will become distorted. Anything natural and repressed will become distorted. And usually it'll still be acted out and just in like a distorted way. So these are just some of the distortions that I wanted to tap into just a little bit. I got these ideas in generally from Mark Jones, and he was saying in high incident rape cultures, somebody did a study, and there was 4 main things that they found in all of these cultures. The first thing was a distant male sky god. The second thing was gender segregation from infancy. The third thing was a highly developed military. And the fourth thing was famine or forced migration within the previous 2 centuries. And that last one was one that I really, really thought was interesting, you know, because even thinking about the sexual impulse coming from the primal brain is just like worrying about survival, right? So having famine or feeling like you're forced from where you feel safe, that will definitely put us in a more, you know, fight or flight mode. And that can like kick up the, you know, the Mars energy I perceive it as, you know, all of these things can just, you know, kick up the need to survive. And if you feel like you have to repress that energy within the society you live in, then it might come out distorted, like I was saying before. And codependency is the second one. And codependency can create resentment and distorted rage as well. Yeah, particularly when people are like feeling like they sacrificed themselves for another person, then yeah, it leads to resentment. It just leads to resentment. And this is always really important to understand too, that there's a big difference between codependency and commitment. Because I heard Mark Jones say this. He said, with no commitment, depth can't even be accessed. And sometimes there's like a blurry line between those two things, you know. But the codependency is definitely all about like excess proximity. It's like projecting the deep needs onto another person, or even projecting ultimate meaning onto a person or a relationship, you know, is the basis of codependency. And yeah, like I was just talking about projections, it's the need for the other to stay secure and to feel value from within ourselves. And I just asked the question, what happens when we hand over our inner gold? What happens when we take what's precious inside of us and then give it to another person to have? Okay, sexuality through the generations. And these are just some really, really short sayings right here, or short things to think about when we think about the generations and how sexuality played out within the generations. So Pluto in Cancer is security in issues relative to gender roles. So I know I heard Kim Marie and Jeffrey Wolf Green talk about Betty Crocker and Marlboro Man. There's just like these specific roles that people had to play. And sometimes that could be disempowering Pluto to the ego structure or the way that somebody perceived their emotional identity, which is like in Cancer. So, you know, those things and how people were like playing out their sexuality was like a big thing. Obviously, like I was saying in the beginning, it is a spectrum, and that spectrum is very vast, but this is just something that was highlighted there. Pluto in Leo, excess self-identification with the act itself. So just pretty much like, you know, like the other one I was saying, like disempowered from, you know, your emotional identity. And this one is like trying to find empowerment, Pluto, through like self-aggrandizement, or like, yeah, just making this, inflating the ego when you do it. You know, even pornography was getting really, really big around this time. So it's just like, somebody film this greatness, please. Appreciate it. You know, just looking at it from that perspective. Always, like I said, the spectrum is vast, but these are just some highlighted things. Pluto in Virgo, ranging from indiscriminate sexuality to rejecting sexuality completely. So the Virgo function, from my perspective, a lot of times is definitely about discernment. It's about discernment. So if you reject sexuality, then maybe you like need to find some more discernment and know that it's actually a natural thing. And if someone is indiscriminate, sexually, then maybe they need to use more discernment in the partners that are choosing, and not just, with no discernment, having sexual encounters with everyone. Because, like I was saying before, it does affect the emotional body. Pluto and Libra, extreme relationship cycles. I have a good amount of friends who are Pluto and Libra, and this is definitely a great short little snippet of how their sexuality actually is expressed. It'll be like, oh, let me give you all these things that I feel like you need. And then them feeling like they have not asserted what they actually desired, and needing to go do that, or completely rejecting, or like, I'm not going to give you that anymore until I get what I need. And just, yeah, those extremes in in sexuality. The Pluto and Scorpio generation, which is the generation I am in, confronting limitations. There's so many ways to go about the confronting limitations. A lot of times it could just be like seeing the things that were perceived as taboo, or you should and shouldn't do this sexually, and just like needing to like confront that and find what you really, really feel and value uh, in any type of expression, uh, to move forward. In the Pluto and Sag generation, I've interacted with a few of these people, but I didn't necessarily feel like I like grasped necessarily the sexuality with Pluto and Sagittarius. So right here, I put perspective and reflections, because I just wanted to see if anybody in the audience, or if anybody in the comments, if somebody's watching this later, to see what's your perspective on the Pluto and Sagittarius generation. So just going to open up a few seconds and see if anybody has any opinions or perspectives on the Pluto and Sag generation when it comes to sexuality.
I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just briefly, I noticed that there's a lot more, can we call it fluidity, a willingness to explore, as in Sag, as in, well, they're a lot freer to explore after Pluto and Scorpio. So being in Sagittarius, they would be, right?
Right. Totally.
And so they're not all tied up. Like my nephews grew up being able to, try on the princess dress and wear it around and be the fairy with the fairy godmother with the wand, and, explore that without a problem. You know what I mean?
Totally.
So that fluidity and exploration is available to them, where it wasn't when, for Pluto and Leo, Pluto and Cancer, no.
Right. Yeah, 1,000%.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, totally. Appreciate that.
Yeah, Cameron. So, okay, Pluto and Sag, I would say, freedom and adventure are really important. There would be like getting together and exploring the whole philosophy of sexuality. And also, a part of these people needs to be free. So they kind of have one foot out the door, if you know what I mean. That they're not going to give themselves completely, they're not going to commit completely, I think.
Right. Yeah, I feel that. Yeah, they got to stay on their own mythic journey of self. Yeah, I feel that.
Exactly. And one other thing, it's beliefs also. The beliefs, the different beliefs around sexuality, what is natural law, what is natural, and what is just based on belief. And that is something they would explore together as well.
Yeah, I definitely see that highlighted. Definitely. Yeah, appreciate that. Awesome. I appreciate that feedback. Yeah, it gives me some more things to think about. That's why I always love that perspective and reflections. Yeah, I love that. I'm going to have to do an EA Zoom talk on just that one day too.
Well,
okay,
let me just say, you're giving us a lot to think about as well. You are doing so well with this meeting. I'm just enjoying it so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get down to actual planets here. The thing that a lot of people might have been coming here to listen to about. So Mars, we're gonna start with Mars, right? And like it corresponds to the primal brain, like I was saying before. The primal brain is where the sexual impulse emanates from. So, and that's like the conscious desire and like the survival impulse, but also the conscious desire that originates from Pluto, which is the deeper desire, the unconscious desire. And something that I've been having to talk to people about when it comes to Mars energy and how like the conscious desire, it's not like a lot of people in like the spiritual communities, they think like, I am conscious of this thing, you know, and a lot of times that is like, I am very cerebrally cortex aware of it, and I'm going to make this decision. And that's not really how the Mars energy feels to me. I have Mars on the ascendant, so I'm like, I feel like I can say this with like gusto. But yeah, it's like the conscious desire is just like, ooh, that's nice. Like you're just doing it. You're so, it's like you're so conscious of it that you're already doing it before you even know what you're doing. That's the kind of conscious desire that it is when it comes to Mars. So that would just be put into a sexual context, you know? Also, Mars would be like the sexual drive or the urge. And I always think about it as the electrical or an active way where we like try to activate or achieve partnering with someone else. And some of the ideas that like informed me was from this guy I know on Twitter. His name is Sagittarian Mind. He has a lot of great content too as well. And he like blends evolutionary astrology with a bunch of other stuff. So yeah, I just want to give him a shout out real quick because he does great work. But yeah, so like also saying Mars is electric or active, we can also say right there that is masculine energy. And that's not like masculine as in male, female. Let's keep that in perspective. It's like electric, it's like yang, it's like active, it's like masculine. And remembering that that is a principle. So Mars retrograde from a sexual perspective, the desired nature is often not externalized, right? Even when we think about retrograde, we always think of the word re. So it's like, I desire, it's like, reel it in, rethink about it. You know, so the desired nature is often just like not externalized like how Mars naturally would be. Yeah, so the instincts from a soul perspective are being pulled back in order to review them. I have actually met some people who I guess didn't get this message because they're still like acting out. So sometimes I also think that is the need to review how they have been doing it in this life as well. Because some Mars retrogrades, to clear that up, some Mars retrogrades I see that it's hard for them to assert themselves, and some are just like asserting themselves so much that it's actually having them being thrown back in on themselves to have to review it in this life. Right. Review in order to turn impulse action into considered action. Ooh, yeah, that was the perfect way to say it right there. Turn the impulsive action, like I was saying, the conscious, like how you just are consciously doing it, like you're just doing it and don't even know it. That's how conscious it is, to like how people are saying, oh, I'm so conscious of what's happening, you know, like going from the impulse to the consideration. Yeah. And will have a frequent desire and drive to release sexually. And this is not dependent on another person. So yeah, they just have like a strong internal Mars energy. So when you're feeling that, you know, yeah, God forbid you don't release, you know, it's necessary. It's just necessary. So anybody who has Mars retrograde, or you know that has Mars retrograde, if they feel like guilt or shame around that, you know, please somebody validate that person, please. Because just imagine for a second, somebody with a Mars retrograde and they have the frequent desire to release sexually. And the religious conditioning that they're in is, you know, Southern Baptist, right? And the parental conditioning is, this is wrong, deny the flesh. Just imagine how much this would do to a person who just literally has this in their soul to, you know, frequently desire to release. You know, it's huge. And just talking to people, like so many people who are like awakening, or, you know, whatever, who have come from a Southern Baptist conditioning perspective, it just validates them so much, and it can change somebody's whole reality in moments just to validate this energy that they have. Yeah, so just super important. I had to digress and slow down a little bit there. It's so important to understand that. Yeah, so instructing the ego to inwardly tune in to align to the actions with the soul desires. So it's as if like this person with the Mars retrograde energy was just doing things on a, a more primal, maybe even selfish level. And maybe the soul is asking it to attune to something more, to something deeper. So yeah, that's Mars retrograde. And this is something I want to talk about a little bit too as well when it comes to Mars and the anatomy. Mars and the anatomy. Because a lot of times in astrology and sexuality, people don't necessarily talk about the actual anatomical functions that correspond to the planets that they're talking about. So with Mars, it's the adrenal glands, and we have to understand with the adrenal glands, they make so many different types of hormones. So if the adrenal glands are overactive and the desire nature is excessive, what does that do? What does that do with a person's sexuality? We have to be mindful of that. We can be astrologers all we want, and we can see what's going on in a chart. But if we're sitting in front of somebody and they're like getting closer to adrenal burnout, and we're not addressing that, and we're talking about what their desire should or shouldn't be, then there is no desire. There's no desire if their adrenal glands are burned out. So we can't even necessarily work with them on a different level until we can get them to be at a specific point. So this is super important. In males, testosterone is corresponding to Mars. In females, I'm pretty sure it's androgen, but don't quote me on that. Androgen, yeah, which is the precursor to testosterone in males as well. So yeah, just something to think about. How is my sex drive? And in looking at a chart, yeah, like maybe Mars is in Pisces, so you feel like it's dispersive. But if you're actually just sleepy all the time, your adrenal glands aren't functioning properly, then maybe you want to, not saying necessarily put down the chart, but maybe you need to go figure out what's going on with that. And then Venus. Venus is the way in which we relate to, or I say the way in which we relate to reality itself. And that could be inner, like the way that we relate inside of ourselves. And it could be the way that we relate from an outer side, which one would be Taurus and the other would be Libra. So the inner side would be Taurus, about how I feel about me. And I also have been deeply tuning into is also how I feel about Earth, because that is like, I am Earth. I am nature. And I orient and maybe I have Venus retrograde. So I'm like, this is how I look at Venus. But yeah, it's just like I deeply resonate with Earth being a part of me, or me being a part of Earth, So that's the inner side. And the outer side is like how we interact with others. And if we project our value onto other people, then knowing that really is still about us on some level. It's about how we're relating to the whole reality. And we can do that inwardly in Taurus, and we can do that outwardly in Libra. It is also our personal magnetism. So like I was saying with Mars, it's about like the electrical way, or the active way, or the yang masculine way that we go about engaging in things. And in Venus, it's more, bringing it in. It's more yin. It's more fluid. It's more passive even. But still depending on the sign that the Venus is in. It doesn't necessarily have to always be passive, but it does have more of a feminine energy in that way. And Venus retrograde has a necessary individuation process in how one orients to relationships. And within the past few years, I've become highly aware of this because I do have Venus retrograde in my chart personally in the first house. So yeah, even sometimes I actually relate inwardly more to like plants and crystals and nature more than I do people. So I have like reframed how I look at it as like, like sexuality, it doesn't have to necessarily be like having sexual intercourse, right? It could be like the union, or like tapping into the creative energy of another thing, right? So even right now in this moment, right, like I'm sitting here like tapping into how these two crystals I'm holding in my hand are making me feel, there's a union in that, there is something inherently I would say, sexual about that. And going back to how we're conditioned and understanding that creative energy is sexual energy. Creative energy is sexual energy. So we need to also just like open the spectrum on what we consider to be sexual, and how we can like lend that to like having creativity in different spaces and not just in a root chakra primal kind of sense. Yeah. So Venus retrograde also is named to throw off the norms of the meaning of life, how how to interact with relationship expectations, and how we define ourselves. So when we're doing that sexually, like that can be very broad. From since it is Venus retrograde, it's an individuation process, so that's going to look really different for a lot of people. Like I was saying before, look at the conditioning, look at the sign, look at the houses, look at the aspects, and that will give more information on that. So Venus in the anatomy. So Venus in the anatomy, it rules the urinary tract as a whole, and it also rules the kidneys. It also rules the kidneys. So this is something that's super important because the kidneys and the adrenals, so it's like we're saying Mars and Venus aren't that far from each other, right? And even if you think about it in the sky, they're not that far from each other, right? They don't go too far from each other. You know, there's always a relationship between the two. And so staying mindful of that, because even like you're saying, the adrenals are on top of the kidneys, right? Not that far from each other. And also knowing that the kidneys flush out toxins, right? They have that more like magnetic energy. They're like pulling in things to release them through the process of the bladder and such and such. But yeah, so the urinary tract, making sure the urinary tract is clean is super important, because if the urinary tract is not clean, then the sexual function can just become stagnant. And, you know, that is the basis a lot of times for men having erectile dysfunction or a woman having PCOS, which would cause sexuality to be painful. And if we don't understand those things, yeah, doing a chart reading for somebody based off of their sexuality while they have PCOS or while they have erectile dysfunction, and not understanding how Venus could correspond to you know, stagnation in that region can be super important. And it can be that simple. It could be that simple that is the issue, that is actually just in their physical body. It's not necessarily always psychological or always emotional. But as I said before, every single body needs to be put into that consideration, right? So Mars and Venus phases. Mars and Venus phases. So the phasal relationship, and this is a specific quote from Rejectable Green, will correlate to how the soul is oriented to actualize relationship dynamics itself, and how its needs for necessary freedom to actualize overall evolutionary and karmic intentions interrelate. So how those two are like interacting together, you know, the need to like move forward or express oneself or be free to engage in relationships, you know, and it will inform how new or old those dynamics are within the current phasal relationship. So let's say Mars and Venus are in new phase. Yeah, that person is starting a new phase, and they're going to need to be able to instinctually engage in relationships as they please, you know. And this is going back to conditioning again. Like some people have some type of conditioning in their head, right? Like their parents could be like, when you're with that person, or like their religion or anything, when you're with somebody, you stay in that relationship forever. You know, you just hold on tight to it. You can work out anything and stuff like that. And it's like, man, I got Mars 2 degrees away from Venus. That is not my thing. That is not my thing. So it's super important to look at the Mars Venus phase and see and refer back to phasal relationships within the Pluto book volume 1 potentially, but the Pluto book volume 2, and it's talking about relationships. Great book, great book. So glad that I went back into that book to go into more depth in my practice, because it has a wealth of information. Just a warning, sometimes you only can read like 2 pages because it's so intense. Like it's so intense and so penetrating, especially if you like to reflect on things like I do, because I have a stellium in Capricorn. Okay, now we're going to talk about the elements. The elements when it comes to their sexual energy. So with the fire, and I got this information specifically mostly from Mark Jones. He has a talk on sexuality, and it's on his website, and I think it's on Astrology University as well. So yeah, just open invite for people to tune in to some of the resources that I use, so you can learn for yourself and perceive for yourself. Yeah. So the fire element has a tendency towards non-monogamy, right? Even if we think back to the basis of evolutionary astrology, when they talk about fire signs, they're saying like they have an inherent destiny that they can feel inside of themselves. So whenever we have that, if you have a destiny that you feel like you need to fulfill, a lot of times you're not going to tend towards having monogamy to like be tied to one person, because you have a destiny and you want to go fulfill it, and you don't want another person to be stopping you from doing that, whether that's sexually or not. It also corresponds to the need or desire to have excitement in the sexuality, to have passion, and it also can be very quick. But if it is quick, let's hope it's exciting and passionate, right? The air signs also tend towards non-monogamy, and they have an innate curiosity and experimental way about going about sexuality. And it also is the element that has what they say the highest potential for bisexuality. I actually have seen, in my reality, that be confirmed with the people that I know who say that they're bisexual. They actually do tend to have a lot of air in their chart, and I still definitely feel like I have to tap in more to that and get more charts to tune into that. But I definitely feel that for sure, because I don't want to be limiting in that way to people who, if they don't have enough air in their chart, but they're still bisexual, and oh my gosh, am I supposed to be this way? I'm not trying to say that, so everybody just be mindful of that. And also something important about the air signs is knowing that love is not to be mentally understood, but to be felt. Not to be mentally understood, but to be felt. So knowing that, yeah, if you have air energy, that's fine, but know that it's still a feeling process. It's still a feeling process that's occurring. And no matter what, nobody's going to have just all air when it comes to their sexual energy. And specifically when I'm saying fire, air, earth, and water in this case, I'm specifically referring to Venus, Mars, the ascendant or the first house, and the second house. And it can be other factors, but specifically those are the things that I'm working with right now. Like you could also look to Aries, you could also look to Taurus, Libra, Pluto, and Scorpio. And even for myself, because I like transcendent things a lot of times, or the idea of it, but Neptune and Pisces as well in the 12th house. Yeah. So the water signs. Oh, let me take a step back real quick. So just the idea of the air element and the fire element being non-monogamous, and seeing that they're masculine signs, or let's say active signs. So when you're active, you're like going out and doing things. So that would energetically be non-monogamous, just on that much of a simple level. And those two things aren't like coming in and being cohesive usually, right? The air is usually dispersing out, and fire is like, going up in the air. Yeah, so the water element tends towards monogamy. And the water signs like taking sexuality and make it sacred by engaging emotions through like the unification of things. Even thinking about water, you put it on the floor and it just like goes into it. And you put it in a cup and it just like molds into that space, It's with that thing, right? The tendency towards monogamy, thinking about that, it is with that thing. It's becoming that thing on some level. And it's uniting, that energy. And yeah, I say taking sexuality and making it sacred by engaging emotions through unification of spirit and flesh. And yeah, that's me kind of being idealistic there for sure, because it can just be somebody who's needy and needs somebody to emotionally support them, and maybe they're being excessively emotional about that process. So that can look a lot of ways. Like I always say, the spectrum is real. And earth signs have a tendency towards monogamy as well. Even if you think about earth is steady, taking his time. So when you take your time, it's probably not the best to deal with a lot of people, right? Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and also the earth signs, when it comes to sexuality, they have a tendency towards needing sustained touch and duration, right? Taking your time. Even if you think about the earth element, like, because I practice herbalism and I think about like people's tissue states, the earth element corresponds directly to cold, depressed tissue state. So it's like when something's cold and depressed, it takes time to get it going. You got to get that energy moving. Yeah, so take your time, touch me a while, let me, get warmed up. Yeah, and then Jeffrey Wolf Green also said the earth element was what's called meat and potato sex. So it's just like pretty like I'm not gonna say boring, but boring kind of, So, or it could just be basic or simple, not boring. It doesn't have to be that, because if two people come together with an intention and do things that are simple, that it doesn't necessarily mean it's boring. So yeah, I had to correct myself on that. Okay, so this is the last slide that I have, and this is what I've been thinking about and talking to my friend about, is what's called elemental embodiment. So the thing about it is each element is going to correspond to something. So the earth is the body, the water is the emotions, the air is the mind, and fire in this case specifically is spirit. And I was reading this book, and I'll post it in the YouTube comments below, and I also will post it in the EA Zoom meeting group with what the book is that I'm talking about specifically in this topic right here. And each of these things, so like let's say the body, right? Earth is the body. There's 4 different embodiment tools that also correspond to the elements, but I'm not gonna go that far with it. I'm just gonna tell everybody what they are. So the body, we can use as in like a form of embodiment tools. We can use breath, we can use sound, we can use movement, and we can use imagination, right? And we can use all those things with our body. With the breath in the body, it's like using the breath literally to arouse the body or to relax the body. And that gets like the autonomic nervous system to be in a proper state of being so that we can engage in sexual activity. In sound, when it comes to the body, the sounds that we make, they have a hold of vibration. So knowing that, even just the simple things is like, let's say moaning, me personally, in my practice, I even get people like when they're eating food to open up their pleasure body. It's like, this food is so good, you got to get into it. Especially a lot of us are just like so repressed, especially with that earth element, just like repressing and holding in that pleasure. We got to, make noise and move our body to get with it. Yeah. So that's even going to movement from the body perspective is literally just like moving your spine so the energy can move through your body and making sure your pelvic floor has mobility in it. Super important for sexual activity, And then also imagination. So while we're breathing, while we're making the sounds, while we're doing the movement, focus on how that feels and imagine just like every part of your body smiling while you do it. So it's like even like breathing deeply, making that noise and then doing a movement with it and just feeling a smile, like an inner smile within your body, So that's the body and embodiment tools that go with that. When it comes to the emotions, using the breath, they say using the breath to bring pleasure and renewal to every cell. So just like feeling into your body completely and feeling into your emotional body with your breath. Yeah. And then so with sound, giving voice to emotions with courage, right? So if you can give voice to your emotions with courage, that can open up to express ourselves more sexually. And then movement is just expressing our emotions with our body movements, which would help us release stagnation and trauma that we carry with us all the time. So even I have a lot of people do the practice where you turn on a song, if specifically working on sexuality and like, let's say someone had like some sexual repression, you turn on a song that is sexual, that makes you feel like the energy of sexuality, and you move and you just dance with it based off how you feel. And then imagination is just like building the capacity for loving connection and living with an open heart. Yeah, just imagine that. Like, what does that look like to you? What does that feel like to you? And when it comes to our mind, using the breath to calm down anxiety. In the sound, the embodiment tool of sound with the air element would be learning how to communicate, ask for what we need. The movement would be using mindful awareness to tune into our inner impulses. You know, it's just like using the swiftness of our mind to be able to tune into like what we really feel we want, right? And that's how we can use the air element more when it comes to sexuality, like how to communicate and how to figure out what we want so that we can get into the act, you know? And then the imagination is just like, from my perspective, like cultivating mindfulness, like I was saying before, but also managing distractions, because in our imagination, we could be literally imagining this is somebody else. And that's not helpful when we're trying to be embodied in a sexual moment. And then in fire as spirit, the breath is the inspiration that the spirit brings, right? Spirit and the breath are like just one and the same sometimes from my perspective. The sound is prayer and celebration. It also can be ritual and ceremony, you know, having spirit come into a sexual practice. A lot of people like to do like rituals or ceremonies around it. And that could even like fire spices things up, that can make things more passionate. It could bring more excitement. Movement, it could just be a static dance or like spontaneous movement, you know, prior to the act. It could just be like expressing yourself in that way, in a very spontaneous, excited, passionate, very direct, not like no thought, just go and just express yourself. And that can help open up the sexual energy within a person. And then the imagination, there's many tools of imagination when it comes to opening up spirit, like the spirit or fire energy when it comes to sexuality. A lot of people do what's called yoni breathing or lingam breathing, which is just literally imagining like light going to your sexual organs while you breathe. And yeah, so that's just the imagination of it. Yeah. So that's just definitely a fundamental look at how I'm like beginning to perceive sexuality and astrology. And that's just part one, which based off of how I've worked with everything, I'm probably gonna end up having like 3 or 4 parts to this. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, just let me know. Feedback, ideas, reflections, perspectives.
I loved it. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, lots to think about there. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was good because some of the stuff, you know, is new way of looking at things, and I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I love your delivery. It was very clear and, you know, step by step, very Capricornian. I love that. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad I could represent.
I had a question as far as Venus, the Taurus side of Venus, where that's the, you know, your relationship to self. Wouldn't that be, I would think that that would be kind of important, because when you don't feel good about yourself for whatever reason, you know, there's a difference when you feel good about yourself, you know, when you're feeling yourself, you know, can't nobody tell you, I mean, you feel sexy, but when you don't, you know, you're not wanting to even engage with anybody in that way because you don't even, you know, feel that good about yourself.
Oh yeah, 1,000%. Yeah, even thinking about the inner side of Venus in the Taurus archetype, a lot of times they were talking about like the need for people who possess that energy to like learn how to perform sexual acts on themselves, you know, like to masturbate and stuff like that, so they can like tune in more to how they feel in their body, you know, so they can get that sexy feel to them too. So yeah, I resonate with that 1000%. So thank you everybody for coming and listening to my talk, and look out for the next one because I'm definitely all up in this topic. So yeah, next times I'll probably be going in on the signs specifically and how it correlates with Mars and Venus, or maybe next go around I'll do Mars, and then the next go around I'll do Venus. So I appreciate everybody. Stay blessed.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Cameron Allen. We'll look forward to catching you next time. Bye.
Appreciate you as always. Thanks.